Just to let you know, we're recording, so you'll get that little pop-up that says hit continue. If you're uncomfortable being on camera, you can go ahead and turn off your video, just participate by chat, whatever you'd like to do. Okay. So welcome to our workshop that Karen and I have been working on, having a lot of fun working on, reading intensive projects, strategies, and digital tools for success. I am Melissa Guadron. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a PhD candidate in rhetoric and composition literacy, and I focus in on rhetorics of health and medicine and disability studies.
And I'm Kira Hambrick. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm also a fourth-year PhD candidate in the RCL program. I'm more on the composition literacy side of the house. My research focuses on culturally relevant pedagogy in the writing classroom. I'm also interested in grad education and grad writing, so I was very excited to get to work with Melissa on this workshop. So we wanted to begin with a land acknowledgement based on an excerpt from Why Race Matters, which is a workshop run in Spokane, Washington. Today, we remember that we live on stolen indigenous land of the Shawnee, Miami, Wyandot, and Delaware nations, who have stewarded this land for generations. We pay respects to elders both past and present. Further, we recognize the devastating consequences of ongoing colonization on these peoples and this land. It is important that we do not mythologize these communities, for when we do, we risk mythologizing and minimizing the harm of colonization. Instead, we recognize how Indigenous folks' pasts connect to their present. We honor the traditions, ways of living, and knowledge they have carried for generations. Finally, we need to continue to center the voices, leadership, and solutions of Indigenous people in our community and around the world. One way to acknowledge Indigenous people's ongoing work in Central Ohio is by supporting the Native American Indian Center of Central Ohio, or NACO, through a donation. The RCL program has kindly agreed to match up to $100 in donation to NACO. If you'd like to donate, you may do so directly and just let us know what amount you've contributed so that we can make sure that we report that to the RCL program for the match. Or you can send your contributions to me via Venmo. I am at kham with a B at the end, so KHAMB, and that's in the chat as well. So I'll be making a donation today with my contribution, and I think Melissa's going to send hers to me too. So yeah, so thank you for considering this. We also wanted to offer this as an extension to land acknowledgement, so taking some direct action. So thank you for joining us.
And then we want to add in an accessibility statement just to acknowledge that at this time, we are each experiencing this event from our own spaces. So for the next hour and a half, please feel invited to participate in any way that is accessible and comfortable to you. So you might want to get up, move around, sit back down, shift in your seat, go get your cat or your dog. My dog will probably be scratching at the door, so you might hear that. And you can also turn off your camera and just contribute through the chat function if you'd like. If you would like, you can also enable the automated captions on Zoom by clicking on the live transcript button on the bottom half of your Zoom screen and then selecting enable auto transcription. It's not going to be 100% as you all know, but it can be helpful. Okay.
So there are a number of topics that we will cover with everyone today. So our plan for the workshop time is to provide somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes of presentation on topics including how to compose reading lists, whether that's for exams or other large projects like a dissertation. Also, we'll be talking about pacing and boundary setting and support systems for getting through big exam or reading lists. And then third, we'll be talking about tools that we've used and talk through some examples of workflows that have worked for us. And then the second half of the workshop time today is really fully devoted to whatever you need the time to be. So it's an opportunity to establish key questions and goals, to brainstorm, to maybe begin working with tools that might be new to you, to think about outlining a timeline or whatever else makes that helpful. So through the interactive presentation portion, we will have little breaks where you can pause and reflect and do some writing. And throughout, if you have questions, ask them. We're happy to chat.
So we're going to start with composing lists. When you're creating your reading list, what we really want to focus on is objectives and key questions. For example, we have, what's the overall purpose of this reading project? What do I hope to learn or confirm? What soft or hard deadlines do I have to have and respect? And what will I still need to understand more about, or what will I now need to know? And Kira has curated these wonderful sample reading questions that are provided in the advice doc and in a Google form, and then we'll go into those with a little bit more detail later on in the presentation. So just to get the brain juices flowing of what kind of questions we want to ask ourselves.
So one of the most important things to think about when you're planning a reading intensive project is how to set boundaries for yourself and also for other folks or commitments in your life. Yes, thank you, Jessica, for asking for a copy of the slides. We can get those to you. I think I have a copy downloaded. Okay, it is slowly loading to the chat. All right. So when you're thinking about setting boundaries, one thing to keep in mind is knowing and preserving your best times for reading and thinking. So that might mean that you do your best thinking first thing in the morning, or maybe that's midday, or maybe late at night. Whatever is true for you, I think it's important to kind of authentically recognize when you do your best work and just let that be the time that you do your best work. So if you're naturally a night owl, don't force yourself to be an early bird, and vice versa. As part of boundary setting, it's also really important to take regular days off from reading. I know in grad school that can sound impossible when there's so much demanding on our time. But Melissa and I really never read on Sundays or most Saturdays. And I pretty quickly got to the point where I basically would stop reading when I just didn't have the energy to. So usually after like 4 or 5 in the afternoon, unless I was just really, really hyped up on a particular reading, and then I would read it until kind of late at night. But it's also helpful and important to help your family, your roommates, your colleagues recognize when you're working and thus when you need to be left alone. So I made a series of door signs for my little office door here. So I have a little command strip with a hook on it on my door. And I have these images that are displayed here on our slide. So I have a picture of Grumpy Cat that says work in progress, do not disturb. And on the reverse side, there's a picture of a little kitten up on his back legs, kind of marching into the sun. And it says, my work here is done. So I use that sign to signal when I really shouldn't be asked questions about anything. I'll accept offerings of tea, but that's about it. You can also use headphones as a don't talk to me sign, or whatever else helps you to indicate to other folks that you just need to be allowed to read. It's also helpful to find a productive place to work. So working from home has kind of become the new norm for a lot of us, but at least for me, it's not ideal, hence the need for the signs. So if home is too loud, you might try going to a library or to a park or to a cafe, going to your office on campus, if that's a place that feels productive. But wherever you go to work, it's important also to set limits on how long you stay with a particular text before moving on to the next one. So you might think about how much time to spend taking notes and annotating, maybe following up on doing secondary research. Um, so, I think with some texts, especially really long, complex texts, it might be tempting to spend a really, really long time with them. So you just have to think about whether that's really in the best interests of your project and your time and your well-being, or if you just need to put it aside and go, well, I tried. And then finally, remember that it's okay to break your own rules every once in a while. But if you find that you're making a habit of it, that's probably a sign that you should consider new rules for yourself or think through ways of changing your workflow. So I know that I changed my workflow multiple times while I was reading for candidacy exams. And the first time I changed, I felt kind of guilty about it. And then I got over that, and that was good. So don't be afraid of changing things if it's just not working.
Yeah, I thought I was going to wake up, have breakfast, and immediately start reading, and that just didn't work out. It just didn't. So next we want to talk about pacing, because you have such a large undertaking, and you need to know how quickly or how slowly you want to go. And what's really important to realize is that pacing is determined by multiple factors. So we have texts themselves can determine your pacing. So if it's a really dense, really theoretical text, I know that I take way longer to read theory than I do just research. So you should be able to plan for these things. So knowing yourself and your pacing, but then also if it's a topic you're really excited about, you might read it a little more quickly. If it's boring, you might read it a lot slowly or become really distracted, which can extend your time. Accessibility and style of the text can also affect your pacing, and then length. And as I said, if it's boring or you're just not as interested as you thought you might be, all of these factors can determine pacing. Also, touching back on what Kira said, your environment, if you're not in a comfortable, productive environment, it can take you longer to read something. If you're in your ideal spot, maybe you just zoom through things. And then you also have to consider that we unfortunately cannot devote all of our time and attention to these kinds of projects like we want to, and we are multifaceted people with multiple responsibilities that need to be respected. So working around what you know you need to do and being mindful of that, and also being flexible, that it's not the end of the world if you have to push an article off to the next day because you have a commitment with your partner. And then just your body mind, how you're doing that day. If you have brain fog, maybe you should take the day off. Or if you're really tired, if you just can't concentrate. I know that sometimes there were days where I just couldn't concentrate and I just had to be okay with sitting down somewhere else and walking away and coming back later. And then also just knowing the pace that works best with you digesting the material. So for myself, it takes me like 2 to 3 days to read a book, but my partner can read 2 to 3 books in a day. And so I just know that is inconceivable to me, and I can't do it, but it works well for him. So not letting yourself be pressured by these other external boundaries or deadlines or things like that, and knowing yourself and what works best for you and reading at that pace. So a good idea would be to drop a reading schedule that you can loosely follow, or if you really need to strictly follow it for those hard deadlines. But keeping in mind that you can reset most deadlines. You can even reset your exam date if you need to. And you can do that with your advisor and Kathleen and Almond, but they're very flexible. And then also, if planning forwards makes you a little too anxious, you can try backwards planning. So knowing, this is when the literature review is due, or this is when my exam is going to be, and working backward from there. And it doesn't matter if you're the tortoise or the hare, as long as you accomplish your goal. So go at the pace that is best for you.
Another thing that we want to encourage you to think really seriously about is support. So it might feel like you're alone in accomplishing these large goals, especially reading for exams can feel and be very isolating because that's really when you're starting to focus in on your particular little corner of the academic world. So it can feel like you're the only one who's interested in those kinds of research questions or texts, but you're not. So identify and lean on a support system. So that might be family, it might be friends, it might be a partner, maybe it's folks in your office, maybe it's folks who have nothing to do with higher ed and the kinds of work that you're thinking about. So think about, who you can lean on for that kind of support. And a good way to know whether you understand the material well enough to be able to move on to the next text is if you can explain it to someone else, even a pet or plant counts. I'm surprised that my little reading assistant isn't here in front of the computer right now. He must not realize that I'm on Zoom. But I have a 12-year-old cat who I adopted the first semester of my master's program. Yes, that's how long ago I was a master's student. And I read everything to him. So I would explain everything to him. So that cat knows more about eco-criticism and literary theory than I think a lot of cats do. So having conversations with your advisor or co-author or committee members can also be helpful. If you have a good relationship with your advisor, they can kind of pull you back from the brink and, whether you're worried about, do I understand enough? Am I doing this right? And then for exams specifically, having conversations with your advisor and other committee members can help shape your exam questions. So that was really helpful for me. I was able to kind of plant some seeds in my committee members' minds about what kinds of things I was really honing in on and finding interesting. And the conversations that we had really did shape the questions that they then submitted to my advisor and then I got. So I could look at those questions and go, oh, that was because of that conversation I had with that person. Okay, cool. So keep that in mind. And then finally, I think it's really important to find ways to reward yourself. We don't do that enough. And I don't think that there's enough reward and support built into grad education. We're meant to kind of do everything very independently and just kind of like work all the time. So you might think about what a good reward feels like. I will say though, and this is from experience, that you shouldn't use rest as a reward. Rest is your right. Okay, so you should always rest when you need to, and find other ways of rewarding yourself. So maybe that's your favorite tea, or maybe it's a walk around the block in the leaves. Maybe after you get halfway through a reading list or quarter of the way through a project, you buy yourself a thing that you've been wanting for a long time and not letting yourself have. Twizzlers. Okay, for Krista, that's Twizzlers. That's really cool. I don't like Twizzlers, but that's okay if you do. Yeah, so just think about ways to reward yourself and maybe build that into your timeline and your pacing, because that can be really productive.
When I passed exams, I had folks texting me how I was celebrating, and I celebrated by having Doritos for lunch. So it can be quite simple, but incredibly enjoyable.
I bought myself houseplants, so
That's on point. So we want to take our first little reflective moment. So we're calling these write and share moments. So we have a prompt on the screen. Think about your own boundaries, pacing, and support systems. What will be important to you as you read? So if you have utensils or tools to write this down, go ahead. Otherwise, you can kind of just sit back and mull it about in your brain, and then we will share, and you can put something in the chat, or you can go ahead and unmute yourself and tell the group. So I think we'll give you about 2 minutes to think over. Okay, if you're writing something down, just take a moment to wrap up your sentence, and then we can begin sharing. Okay. So I will start us off while everyone thinks about what they want to share, and talk about boundaries. Something that Kira and I mentioned is that we didn't work on Sundays at all and didn't really work on Saturdays. And so it's really important, again, to remind yourself that we're only being paid so much to accomplish so much, and you have to draw a line somewhere. Either because it has to do with, at this point, I'm not being paid to do this, I need to stop, or at this point, my brain is no longer going to be working and I need to stop. So respecting your break times and your boundaries of when you'll work and when you won't work, and really being a little firm with yourself, because it can feel a little bad about not working on certain days, but letting yourself know that it is okay to take those breaks. And then Jamie in the chat said, I think I can better protect my boundaries by not checking my phone or answering texts while reading.
I can share. This is Morgan, by the way. It's Morgan Pierce. I'm just sharing with Eduardo right now. I was thinking about it, and I think a big part of kind of like setting up support systems as I start is like, as somebody who lives alone, is making sure that I don't end up like super isolated, especially since a lot of my cohort are MA PhDs, and I came in PhD student and have my MA already, so they're kind of like a semester or so behind. So I'll be like taking that step into this reading kind of by myself in like my social group. So I think just making sure that I maintain that social aspect for my own sanity, and then also finding a good productive space to read and write that's also outside of the place that I will be all the time and like living alone. Because during like my MA, when I was working on my thesis, I would go to the library all the time and just spend like my hours there that I would work and then go home. But since like COVID, I don't think I've stepped foot in the library here other than to like pick up a book. So I think it's going to be like finding that space that's productive for me again, where I can kind of have that separation between like work and home.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Morgan. I got approval from the department to start reading for exams in late February of 2020. So you can imagine that was like right at the peak of the shutdown. So the libraries shut down, campus shut down. I didn't even have access to a lot of the texts on my list because I didn't think about not having access to things and didn't do like a lot of planning ahead. So for me, that kind of social support system really became my advisor. We met every other week to talk about my readings, just to kind of give me a chance to like verbally process what I was thinking about and what I was noticing. And so that ended up being really helpful. So sometimes that support system can be the academic kind of committee that you're working with. And other times I think it can be the folks in your social group. Maybe they're not reading for exams, but maybe they're working on their program of study or their PPOS or, other pieces of the program or just a seminar paper. So thank you for sharing that. And Jessica shared in the chat, I think one thing I am figuring out is that I'm fiercely protective of my boundaries. However, the load of work and assumptions of PhDs can sometimes bring with it guilt for having limited time and capacity to read since my pacing is on the slower end. I'm a very slow reader. I spend a lot of time taking notes. And I noticed that just from my reading experience that the first list that I read through was much slower for me to get through than any other list. Just because I was kind of building that foundation of familiarity with my fields. Once I had that, then I could kind of more quickly go, oh, they're referencing that other thing that I've already read, so I don't need to spend as much time with this text. But yeah, those are all helpful. Thank you. Would anyone else like to share? Okay. So moving on, one of the other things that we wanted to chat with you about is thinking about the difference between your reading notes and your summary or synthesis notes. So Melissa and I both annotated texts while we were reading them, and then went back and filled out our more focused final notes in Excel, which is what Melissa used, or a Google form, which is what I used. So just as some examples of our workflows, Melissa took fairly sparse notes. So she would note keywords, questions, and use underlining in the actual text because she knew that she would elaborate more in her note-taking document. I kind of did the opposite. So I'm a really copious note taker within the actual text. So if you ever get a shared PDF from me, you'll notice that there's like all kinds of marginal comments, and I'm just like engaging with the authors and scoffing at things and that kind of stuff. And also mentioning like other sources that it reminds me of. So for me, in my reading style, it's really important for me to focus on trying to condense my notes after I do my initial read through. And so I kind of have if you imagine our reading systems like triangles, Melissa's is a little bit more like an upright triangle where she does a little bit of note taking initially and then really fleshes things out afterwards. And my triangle is upside down. So the big bulk of my work is in the reading, and then I have to kind of focus and narrow things down when I'm synthesizing. So whatever works for you, whatever visual metaphor kind of captures how you read, just lean into whatever you do.
Melissa, you're muted.
Thank you, Jamie. I was just saying, also being mindful that throughout the reading process, your technique may change, and just be open to that. So at the beginning, maybe you start out like Akira and you're taking copious notes, and then you kind of come down and just do underlines, or maybe you're the opposite and you start out with like me and you're underlining and you're saying that's just not enough to make notes. I need to do more. And then you do more annotations. So just being mindful that you don't have to stick with the same plan the whole entire time. And so we're going to talk about some specific software tools. I'll talk a little bit about Zotero, and then Kara will also talk about it because she used it in a different way than I did. But Zotero is a free, easy to use tool to help you collect, organize, cite, and share research. You can download it from Zotero.com. It's Zotero. So it's open source. There are a lot of really great guides. We have the link here, and you'll have the slides later so you can go through and click on everything. And so I specifically used Zotero for building my list. So just clicking and dragging things into the program. And I think I had sub-libraries set up for each of my fields. And so each of my lists were my field lists rather than, my whole comprehensive reading list. And just be mindful that when you use Zotero, sometimes not everything transfers in that you need for a proper citation. So go back through and look through those. I realized that sometimes like the author's name would just be incomplete, or it would only generate the title of the book and the title of like a chapter or something. So you might have to go back in and manually fix things, but it does give you mostly everything. And a lot of the times it just gives you the exact citation you want. Kara?
Yeah, I would just add that with Zotero, if you're finding PDFs through Google Scholar or the library databases, if you have the plugin for Zotero, you can just kind of grab something and have it loaded into your database. And that has gotten a lot better than it used to be, but it still isn't always perfect. There's like certain kinds of articles or chapters sometimes that it really struggles with. Edited collections, I think, are one that it just doesn't always know how to navigate. So it's a good idea to check that. And then also, the way that I used Zotero, I created my lists in a Word document, and then I went through and loaded everything into Zotero. So if I had PDF copies of things, I would import them into that database. If I had print or hard copy versions, I would make sure that I had an annotation for that, or the reference, excuse me, in Zotero. And then usually I would use Zotero to open up my PDFs and take all my notes. Because when you do that, you can actually extract your notes out of the PDF. So in my database, I have like the entry, and then below that, I have the PDF for that file. And then below the PDF, I actually have a note thing called extracted annotations that gives me the time and date that I yanked everything out of the PDF. So that's helpful because it just gives you one place where you can search the content of the PDF if it is OCR compatible or like screen reader compatible. So it can search the body of the PDF and search your notes. So if you made a note to yourself like, oh, check this source, see if they cite blah, 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 you can actually go find that really easily, which is great because I'm very guilty of remembering that I read something or made a note and then spending 2 hours in my computer trying to find a PDF and then never finding it. So Zotero can be good for that. Yeah, and I think that's all I had to add here. So another tool that you can use is Google Forms. So this is something that I did for my reading process. It was actually really helpful, especially in kind of forcing myself to synthesize and condense and not have like a novel of notes for every article that I read. So you can use Google Forms as a basic survey or kind of data intake form. Like I said, I used it to collect my abbreviated reading notes. So for each text or each chapter of a book, I filled out a form, and that was kind of how I noted for myself that I had finished a reading and I could mark it off my list. Melissa did that same process with Excel rather than the Google form. So I have shared a link to my Google form template. And so what I did was my form featured, I think, 7 questions that were sourced from folks like Cindy Self and Gavin Johnson and Margaret Price and Sam Head and Laura Allen. So for every reading, I would note whether it was my major or minor field. And then I would input the name of the text. So I usually did author year. And then I noted which kind of subsection of my major field list it was. And then I just went through and I answered each one of the questions. So summary and implications, context, engagement and application, the methodology, key terms, significant quotations, and then if I had other tags, then I would kind of tag them here. As I got closer to the end of my reading list, or on days that I just didn't have as much energy, I wouldn't always answer all of those questions, but I'd usually try to answer the first 3. So just kind of trying to capture like what conversation is this text joining and how do I think I would use this source in my own work. And so then you can download all of the notes that you make in the form as either an Excel file or a Google Sheets file. So that's one option. For me, it just kind of felt like a clear workflow and a thing that I could check off to know that I was done.
I apologize for my wild screen movements and all of that. So then we're gonna go to Excel. So like Kara said, she used Google Forms, and I did similar to her, but used Excel or you could use Google Sheets. So I think about Excel not as a place where you can write, paragraphs, but for just clear to the point notes. So I would take my longer notes in a Word document, and then I would put them into an Excel. So I very intentionally named my Excel sheet Exam Reading Quick Glance. And I took advantage of the filtering function, so you can filter your columns. And then I had columns such as keywords, text authors, connections. And when it came time for my written, or for when you're writing whatever you're writing, you can then use the filtering function to find what article you're specifically thinking of, or keywords. So say, you need to write about agency. So you would go through and you would filter by agency, or say you want to filter by, Foucault or something like that. Then you would go and you would filter in that way. So I will show you my template as well, which we can also give you the link to it. And you can just copy this if you like it. It's in Google Sheets. You could export it into Excel. And this is just me joking around. So we have an author, it's Buckeye Brutus. We have your subfield or your field, your publication type. And this is what I mean here is it's an article, it's a chapter, it's a book. And then digital copy or hard copy. So you know where to find it if it's on your bookshelf or it's in a file in your computer. And then here it can be a little blurry between lines, but I like to address whether I was reading like, this is a rhetorical analysis, or this is a theory heavy piece, or this is just a research report. So you can also do it through that. And then we have keyword, or you can think of them as constructs, keyword 1, keyword 2, and then the main claim. So this was always a little hard to do because how do you take a book and distill one claim, but it really forces you to think about it. So you have a main claim, your major implication for the field, because you'll definitely be asked to talk about something like that at some point, and then reflect on the impact on your own studies, and then just other connections, keywords, scholars, concepts, and finally extra notes. And I actually ended up using the extra notes section a lot for deciding whether or not I could give students the reading as well. And I still use my Excel sheet to now that I'm teaching Intro to Disability Studies. Is this accessible to my students too, or is it something that I could maybe make a PowerPoint for and explain it to them that way? And then it's also really great to know, oh, this was a great article, I need to return to it and mine the bibliography and come back. Or, this was digital piece, but I'd really like to have hard copy. I'm going to make a note to buy this book. And so feel free and just really erase the Buckeye Brutus part.
And I can also really quickly share a view of the Excel output that I got from my form. So
I was,
yeah. So here is an example of what mine looked like. Can you all see that? I have two screens, so I'm never sure what people see. Okay.
yes.
Yeah. So for example, it'll give you the timestamp. For whatever reason, it didn't actually put the item name where it should have. It just has an author date. So I think that's because I changed my form after I had already started putting in data. But you can see the tags that I was inputting and some notes. And so that's just how it looks. It's not as beautiful as Melissa's Excel file because Melissa created that Excel sheet as kind of like the final product. Mine is a form that's just generating an Excel, right? So I don't have as much control over the final piece. So I just wanted to show that to you.
Yeah, and there's definitely use for both of those styles. Okay. Go back. So then Word docs or Google Docs, like I mentioned, so I took pretty simple notes while I was reading, but I was careful to underline things that I knew I wanted to come back to and elaborate on it. So I used Word as this really lengthy document to put my detailed annotations and then also longer quotes that I wanted to pull out and not feel bad about, like these humongous block quotes. And because no one will see it except me. So it's okay, quote at length if you'd like to. And then I really like using Word in particular because at least the version that I have is really nice where you're working in a document and it's 300 pages long and you leave off at the very bottom and you don't want to scroll all the way through. When you open the document again, there's this little like bookmark that'll say you left off here, and you can just click on it and it'll automatically go to that section in your document. And then also Word is nice because you can change like the background color of the screen. If the white is too much, you can make it like purple or gray or whatever is more accessible to you. And then also we have our Command or Control F function, your search and find, which is always really helpful for locating your keywords and your authors and your texts. And I know both Kira and I still go back to these documents when we're teaching or doing other literature reviews or sharing resources with friends. And then also, I should say this about the Excel. If you're working in a Word document or an Excel doc, it's really nice to be able to upload them to Google Docs, and they have those comparable Google Doc or Google Sheets forms, so it doesn't get too messed up in the transfer. And so it's always really good to have something in the cloud somewhere or on an external hard drive because you put so much work into it, you don't want it to suddenly accidentally disappear. Do you have anything you want to add here, Kira?
Not well, I guess the only thing I would say is that as I got closer to preparing for my written exams, I made annotated bibliographies, and then from those, so for example, one of my minor fields was writing program administration. So I took all of my notes and made an annotated bib for all of the items on my WPA reading list. 2 or so weeks before my written, just because I felt like I needed something to do. And you will feel this way too if you haven't done exams yet. You'll get to the point where there's really nothing left for you to do, but you're going to feel like there's something you should be doing. So I filled that space by trying to condense my whole annotated bib document into just like a couple pages of synthesis, just to practice putting different scholars in conversation with each other. So that was another way that I used Word.
That's really smart.
So if anyone has taken a course with Jonathan Buell, you will know that he loves mind mapping. And so in a couple of courses that I took with him, he introduced us to bubble.us. It's BUBBL.us. So this is a free online, I wrote map mapping. It's a mind mapping tool that can be helpful for creating visual representations of themes or patterns that you're noticing in your data. So for example, you can use it to make timelines of the history of a concept or your field. You can use it to make more traditional concept maps where you have clusters of authors or texts that are focused on one idea. You could create citation maps if you get really interested in kind of who's citing who. You could track relationships between characters or theories or ideas through a relationship kind of map. You can also use Bubble.us or similar tools for outlining manuscripts. I used it to create kind of like an Uber timeline of all of my readings. So every time I opened up a new reading, I would go into Bubble.us and create an entry for it. And I'd like plug in the date of publication on my timeline. And that helped me to kind of see what social and political movements were happening that kind of helped to spur whatever conversation was happening academically. So that wasn't really something that I referenced during my exams at all, but it was helpful just as like another way for me to try to process and synthesize all the stuff I was reading and all the complex connections between like ideas of literacy and what was happening with the history of education at the time. So Bubble.us is a helpful tool, I think, especially if you want to visualize things that you're reading about.
And then we have, I noticed I was muted, and then we have good old pen and pencil. So if you have hard copies of your readings, developing a physical note-taking system is really handy. So I used pencil to underline generally. So just anything that I thought was important, but not the priority. But then what I would do when something was a priority is I would switch to a colored pen and underline that. So, if it was my major field, I used blue. If it was my technical communication field, I used orange. And for disability studies, I used green. And so this was a quick way to be able to go back through my notes and see what was important, but also besides being an excuse to buy fancy pens, it was a way to have my eyes catch, oh, that's blue underlined. I really need to go back and look at that. And then Kira did this as well, but she used her Google form to capture that short summary for each text. And then she tried to copy those short summaries into her Zotero database. So now we're going to take another one of those 2-minute pauses. And we have think about your experience with the tools that we've mentioned. How do you imagine yourself using this software, these tools? What resources and knowledge will you need? So we'll give you 2 minutes. Oops, lo siento. Okay, if you are writing, just finish up your last sentence and then we will share. We already have a good conversation going in the chat. So I will just start. So Remy asked on the Excel sheet that I have, there are arrows next to the words. What formatting did I do there and why? That's the filtering function. And so if I had more examples in the rows, what you could do is click on the arrow. And so instead of it saying just hard copy in my section of it, is it digital or if it's hard copy, I would then see digital and hard copy and I could unclick digital and then only my hard copy text will show. And so that was really useful for thinking about like how much more I had to read and where it was from and all of that. But then also in my keyword sections, say I want to look at fanaticism or football, you know, I can filter through those categories and then specifically have those readings. And then we have a question about Zotero. Kira, can I give that back to you?
Yes. So I think this was Katie Braun's question. So when you store PDFs in Zotero and then you open them, it'll open them with whatever PDF reader is on your device. So for me, that was Adobe Acrobat. The difference is that because it's kind of stored in the Zotero folder and not just in a documents folder on my computer. With one click, I can just extract all my reading notes and have those appear nested under that item in Zotero, which is easier than having to then like go find that file and import it, though you can do that too. And that's what I did with my Excel notes from my Google form, is I would just extract portions of those and then plug them in under different readings. But that, I will be honest, that got a little bit laborious and not as useful the further into my readings I got. So I kind of stopped doing that part of my process. So over time, I definitely simplified how I was reading. Another thing I'll say just kind of generally about Zotero versus Mendeley. I tried Mendeley first because it was really hyped up at the time. And then it deleted my entire library. And I was so traumatized and angry. I was like, never again. But I do really like Zotero because it's open source, which means that it doesn't really belong to any one entity. And a lot of people have created a community so they can work together to support and update and create new features in Zotero. And there's lots of really good kind of collaboratively generated how-to documents. I believe Mendeley was recently, and recently is what is time anymore, but Mendeley was purchased by Elsevier, I believe. So they're kind of in the pocket of big publishers, and I'm not really into that either. So, but there are other tools too. So things like Evernote or Scrivener, like there's all kinds of tools. So, you know, we're not necessarily recommending a particular narrow set of tools as much as we really want to encourage you to think about what tools will help you to feel like you have a handle over the reading projects that you're doing. Okay, so Caleb has shared in the chat that he's using Evernote and takes notes directly in the program and then downloads them as PDFs and then synthesizes the notes with questions like the ones that Melissa and I have showed. Very cool. Yeah, so Caleb is paying for Evernote. I think there is a free version, or there used to be, right? And how much is it, Caleb?
So let's move a little forward, and this is all still relevant in our next section, which is talking about our workflow, especially coming back to Caleb's comment. So first we'll start with Kira sharing her workflow.
Yeah, so to be honest with you, I think there were probably like 7 more steps in my original workflow that I just kind of shed over time as I got into the groove of reading. Because for me, starting out, I think my impulse was to make sure that I like really knew everything about the text that I was reading. And the further along I got, the more I realized that that wasn't the goal. Like, I don't need to know everything and understand every nuance of someone's argument. I really just need the big picture ideas and enough sense of what their work was that I can put it into conversation with my own work, without, terribly mischaracterizing ideas. So to get started, I would upload my digital readings to Zotero. And then for anything that I had in print form, I would manually enter the bibliographic data. You can do that by searching ISBN numbers, and sometimes Zotero gets it and nails it, and sometimes you need to help correct issues with the entry. My reading process was chronologically by topic. So in other words, so my major field is composition studies. One of my sublists in my major field was histories and theories of composition. So I read all of my histories and theories list in chronological order from the oldest to the most recent, and highlighted and annotated my PDFs as I was reading. And then when I finished that list, I would go to the next list. So I had a list that was like critical and cultural theory. So I read that list chronologically. So I was kind of like starting over in the 60s or 70s or 80s, depending on how old some ideas on my list were, which is different from how Melissa read, but she'll talk about that. And then after I entered all my notes and did all my PDF highlighting, then I would go through and enter my summaries in my Google form. Once I did that, then I could put a big line through my reading list item to mark that I had done it and it was finished. As exams approached, I reviewed the PDF notes in Zotero and in my Google form and started condensing things into that annotated bibliography that I talked about. And then I went through and made like an even shorter synthesis document. And throughout this process, my advisor and I met pretty often to talk about my readings and how things were going, what themes and questions I was noticing, what was really irking me about the field. And so those conversations, I think, were one of the most helpful aspects of my preparation, just having someone to just talk about ideas with, and to get kind of a check on whether I was understanding something correctly. So I think these 5 steps are sort of how it ended up at the end. But as I was kind of getting my footing, I tried all kinds of stuff and eventually like shed what was just extra work.
And I have many more steps, but I included a little bit past the point that Kira was sharing. So I, as we've said, built my list with Zotero. And then as it was, beginning of lockdown, I first checked with our amazing English librarian, Jen, to see if she could order books for me if the library didn't already have them, or send them to me via mail, which is what ended up happening. So I think I got like 15, something like that, books from the library, both books that they already owned and books that they ordered and just sent directly to my house, which was really, really nice. And then anything else that she couldn't send or I didn't have digitally, I ended up purchasing from eBay, which I have found to be the most affordable quality choice for getting books online. Half price books is really nice too, but I could always find it cheaper on eBay and it's pretty quick. So I read chronologically across my fields. So my major field is contemporary rhetorical theory, beginning in 1940-ish. So I started in the 1940s And in that Word document, organized my list in that chronological order, but then color coded it so I knew what field it went to, and then just ran across. And that was really useful so that I could see the connections across my fields. So at the same time as I was learning about rhetoric, I was also seeing how rhetoric was used in technical communication. And then I could also see what was happening over in disability studies at the same time, or it really allowed me to see like the history that was established before these other things came in. But that had to change as I got closer to my exam date, where I realized that because I was reading books and articles according to chronologically, I was getting slowed down when I had a book instead of an article. So what I ended up doing was splitting my reading list then by articles and books, and then I just zoomed through all my articles and went back and spent more time on my books. So then I had those annotations in Word, and I first annotated just one for the book, but then I ended up doing it by chapters, which slowed me down, but was way better for processing. And then I put it in Excel, and then I used Excel to make note cards as I was preparing for my written exam. And the process of writing out the note cards for me was more helpful than actually studying with the note cards. But I know other people where the note cards, actually reading them was really helpful, but the actual process was really beneficial with me. And then I waited to really substantially check in with my committee until I had the majority of my list done. And this was because I just wanted to feel that I had a good standing to have these conversations, rather than going in when I was still kind of going like, I don't know, you just explain it to me. Instead, I could read it and then say, okay, this is what I think is happening. Is that correct? What else can we say? And then remember that when you're actually taking your exams, you're allowed to consult with anyone besides your committee members. So take advantage of that. I ended up talking to my partner a lot just to make sure that what I was writing was accessible and it made sense. And then also be kind to yourself and don't do anything the night before your oral exam, because at this point you are the expert and you have read all of the stuff that your committee hasn't, and you have all the knowledge that you need to do an incredibly wonderful job. So just be kind to yourself and take the night off and have a good meal and have a good rest. And then we got advice from others. So Kira and I sent out a survey asking for folks who have passed their exams or taken big reading lists and written literature reviews to share some of the advice that they have. And Kira, do you want to go over the Google Doc?
Yeah. So we offer here on this slide kind of the highlights reel from the advice that we received, and then everything else is sorted into a Google Doc by kind of roughly by topic. So I can show you that document. Except my folder just vanished. There we go. So here is the link to the Google Doc. So the headings are, what should I read? How do I decide which readings to cut? So we've included a range. Oh, thanks, Melissa. So we've included a range of the advice. Oh, do people need access to that link? I will fix that. If you don't have access to that link yet, I will fix it in just a moment to make sure that everybody can get it. But the categories are, what should I read? How do I decide what readings to cut? And there's advice there. There's a lot more information here as well about tools and resources you can use. So we've already talked about Mendeley and Zotero. Some folks talked about Scrivener and Evernote, which are other options. Someone else included a link to their DMAC video about Zotero. There's also a couple of resources, so some other books and blogs. So Dr. Raul Pacheco Vega is very popular. And so his name just appears all over the place, as you've seen. So there he is. And then there's also some general advice on workflows. Yeah, and then from the chat, Morgan asked, if everyone is cool with it, can we save the chat and share for all of these wonderful links? So yes, absolutely, we can do that. So this is a really healthy document. So there's also those 7 reading questions, which are really helpful. And then there's just some general advice at the end, which is a range of things from what kind of snacks are great reading snacks, other ways of organizing your texts. So there's lots of good stuff here. So Melissa, yeah, we should add Twizzlers to the list. So Melissa and I will go through and make sure that we capture some of the links. I know that Jordan shared Voyant, for example, so we'll make sure that those other things get into this document. And maybe this document can become a more permanent fixture on like the RCL wiki page, wherever that lives now. I guess that's probably somewhere in OneDrive, I'm guessing. So maybe that can be like an ongoing document. But just a couple of the highlights. Oh, cool, yeah, RCL info. So a couple of the highlights from the advice document are things like, make sure that you have a clear set of questions to guide and shape your reading and note-taking. If you don't have a clear plan for what to take notes on, you're just going to take notes on too much stuff that isn't going to end up being useful. Know that you do not have to read every single word of every item. I'll repeat that. You do not have to read every single word of every item. There were texts that I just didn't get to read before my exam date, and I passed, so that's okay. Also, I think it's important to know that as far as candidacy exams are concerned, you can make small changes to your exam lists 1 to 2 weeks before sitting the written portion. So a couple weeks before I actually sat my exam, I added a couple of texts that I had discovered through reading other things, and that I really wanted the opportunity to talk about in my exam. I removed texts that either I wasn't technically allowed to have on my list because they were written by committee members, or I removed texts that just sucked and were terrible and weren't relevant. Sometimes you'll get tricked by a really good title that doesn't actually connect to your fields as much as you hope it will. And then sometimes you can substitute texts. So I mentioned that I started reading just as the pandemic shut everything down. So there were some items that I just could not get access to, period. Couldn't even buy them because they were like $200 for a book that's no longer in print. So I found some more recent substitute texts. So yes, you can make some small changes to your reading lists. Just make sure that you talk with your advisor and that they're on board. A really good piece of advice is to read reviews. So if you're reading a book, go find reviews of that book, especially if you can read multiples, just because that gives you a sense of what other people are noticing and what you're noticing about the text. Melissa wanted to add that this is really helpful, especially for difficult or really boring texts, just to kind of see what else is being said about it. Establish a clear routine for when you will and won't read, and really do take days off. Really do take days off. That's so important. And similarly, have a system of accountability. So you can't take every single day off from reading. So make sure that you have a system that keeps you accountable and that includes clear rewards. And just do something that works for you, right? Every person's going to be a little bit different in terms of what they find motivating or stifling. And then finally, find or create a note organization system that works for you and stick with it, but allow yourself to simplify or to abandon systems that just aren't working. And you don't have to have the perfect system figured out initially. You'll kind of figure it out and learn as you go. So again, we'll make sure that you have access to the Google Doc, and then we'll add the other links and things from the chat to that document.
And I want to add, reading reviews can be really validating, especially when you see what you're thinking echoed back in what you're reading. And I will say, particularly for those difficult texts or those inaccessible texts, because I always think it's delightful to see a reviewer saying like, oh, this was really difficult to read, and be like, okay, it was me, it wasn't just me, it was all of us. And they can be really snarky sometimes. It's very funny. So I think maybe actually for time, we'll skip this little write and share, and because we have about 15 minutes. So let's go directly into our general Q&A. So what questions do you have about the topics we covered today? So just to review, we talked about composing reading lists, which included setting goals and objectives and setting goals and objectives. And then we talked about pacing, boundary setting, and support, which is about maintaining that work-life balance, being mindful of what works best for you, talking with others. And then we talked about tools and workflows, Zotero, Google Forms, anything like that. So we can just open up the chat for questions. So you can take a moment to think through that, or if you want to ask your question orally, you can just unmute and ask.
First, I just want to say thank you guys so much for sharing this wealth of information. I'm kind of wondering, like, what are there ways that you prepared for the written portion of the exam?
Yeah, so one of the things that I didn't realize as early as I would like to have known this is that you can actually get access to sample questions. So your advisor might have sample questions from other students' exams, or friends and colleagues in the program can share their questions with you. And that was really helpful just to see the structure of the questions. So one of the things that I noticed about my exam questions is that sometimes they would tell me which sublists I could use to answer a question. So the challenge was sometimes being restricted to a certain number of sublists, and it wasn't that I didn't know what to say or couldn't answer something. It was like, but I really want to talk about this person, but they're not on this list. So I think for practice and getting ready for the written portion, it's helpful to see just the structure of what those questions look like. Even if the questions aren't specific to your field or your interest, just looking at what kind of structure is going to be asked can be really helpful. I think as well, it's helpful to create those synthesis documents. So if you imagine, okay, I've told my advisor I'm really frustrated that composition is trying to constantly reestablish itself as a legitimate field. What is that about? So what question or what texts on my list are engaging that, and what would they say if I put them into conversation with each other? And then how do I join that conversation? So I think any opportunity to practice can be helpful.
And then I would add, so you can also do a little practice written exam if you schedule it with your advisor, and say, a month before my written exam, I'd like you to give me a practice question, and then I'll answer it, and then we will review it and go over it together. So that's a real, tangible way you can practice it. But you can also have meetings with your committee members and ask them to ask questions they would ask in the oral exam. And so that you can get practice with that as well. So, really taking advantage of your committee and asking, what are you going to look for? What kind of questions will you ask? Here's how I'll answer it. What do you think of that? Is really helpful. And then Krista has gone ahead and added a document of practice exam questions in the chat, as well as a copy of a candidacy exam worksheet. And then Remy has said, I'm wondering how folks have crafted reading lists that are representational of how the field is traditionally understood, with like the big scholars and whatnot, but with more largely represents the many marginalized voices in the field. Yeah, I think this is something, if we're going back to objectives and planning your list, this is something that I know I personally had to deal with, which was you need to demonstrate that you can enter your field. And so there are certain names that you will probably need to include. But then there are opportunities where you can say, all right, because, and I know I keep on joking about Foucault, but like, here's Foucault and here is he on my list, but I put him here, now I can put someone else from, you know, like a POC scholar instead. Or it's really nice sometimes to look into Google Scholar and see if someone else has cited that work or done more modern work on it. I know that in disability studies, Irving Goffman is a big name, but a lot of people think he's problematic. So what do? You look for Heather Love, who is a more recent feminist scholar who has done similar work and written about Goffman. So you can kind of do it in those kinds of ways. And then just talking to your committee about being really straight with what kind of goals you have for your list.
Yeah, I'll also add that when I was composing my lists, I was just really honest with my advisor. So I noticed at one point that all of the kind of historical views of the field that I had were just like old white dudes. And I was like, surely someone else has written about this. And so we worked together and she had a couple of suggestions. And then I just talked to other students or, you know, dug around and found other texts and suggested, well, instead of reading this old white guy, how about I read Iris Ruiz? How about I read these other people? And my advisor was really open to that. And I think you can do the same thing. I think it's helpful if you have a clear reason for doing so. And you've just articulated a really good one here in the chat. So I would hope that that would be enough of a reason to intentionally build a more diverse and representative reading list.
That's a really good question, Remy. Thank you for asking. Do we have any other questions? Okay. So if we don't have any questions right now, feel free, please, to send emails to Kira and I, or even Krista, if you have a more logistical question. We are always happy to answer those questions if it comes to you later. We have a couple more minutes left, about 7 in the workshop. So we promised that some hands-on workshop time. So here it is, 7 minutes of it. So in this time, we want you to focus on what will be most useful to you. So for examples, you can start composing that reading list, or you can compose some of those key questions that you want to guide your reading. Something like what Remy brought up of, how do I include a diverse amount of voices? Then you can begin working on with some of the tools that you've heard about today. If you want to download Zotero or log in and make a Bubble US account or Bubble Us account, or you can outline your support networks and boundaries. This one's a little bit more reflective for yourself. You can develop an accountability and reward system for yourself. You just want to think about things you want to eat or things you want to do in these 7 minutes. I suggest that. Or you can start doing some of that backwards planning, identify when you want to take your exams or when you need to submit your prose, and then work backwards. And then you can just take these minutes to do whatever you want and think of something not represented on this list. But we'll be here for these 7 minutes, so you can feel free to still enter things into the chat or unmute yourself and talk to the group. But we want to thank you all for being here with us. So it is 3:29. We want to be mindful of your time. So I just want to thank you all so much for being here with us today. This last slide just has some resources. And we will send an email out with links and things that we've talked about with the chat and all of that. And again, if you'd like to donate, you can send your money directly to the organization, or you can Venmo to Kira, and the RCL department has agreed to match us to $100, which is very nice. Thank you, Krista, for organizing that. We really appreciate that. So thank you to Krista for giving us this idea to have this workshop. Thank you, Kira, for being the most amazing co-workshop host. And thank you for everyone for attending.
I'm just going to co-sign all of that. Great big thanks. This was so much fun.
Bye, everyone.